So this is the crashiest of crash courses in medieval lit, but I know a lot of folks just want like a sweeping impression of SCA period literature without necessarily diving into like the allegories of the 7 deadly sins in Piers Plowman, or debating authorship and dating of the Nibelungenlied, or let's talk about how everyone thinks Shakespeare came up with these stories, but they were actually medieval and classical lit that he reworked. Not to say that Shakespeare wasn't a fantastic writer, I love him, but he did not come up with the story of Tristan and Isolde or Troilus and Crusade. Also, I'm sorry if I mispronounce stuff. I've only read a lot of these terms or haven't heard it since undergrad, but I'm also too lazy to look everything up before recording this. So, I think the biggest misconception is that all medieval literature was religious. It was not. Even if at first glance a piece looks religious, a lot of them look that way on the surface, but were definitely secular once you look at the meat of the content. Decameron may have had a lot of theological themes, but it was not religious in any way. And some of the stories were downright erotic. So Canterbury Tales is another prime example. The stories on the surface may have seemed non-secular, but it was one giant satire. But like, you know, kind of like how you think Shakespeare is all formal till you realize it's full of dick jokes, that kind of thing. A lot of sources will also say that like drama in the Middle Ages was basically always used as a teaching tool for the church. Like, yeah, morality plays and liturgical plays were a thing, and the church did definitely use drama as a teaching tool, but I think it's ridiculous to say that dramas as a whole were predominantly used teaching tools for the Middle Ages, like for the church. And that's pretty broad brush to try to paint an entire genre with. That being said, though, Everyman is actually a pretty well done morality play based on Ars Moriendi, Art of Dying, which is about like living a good life for a nice afterlife in heaven, that kind of thing. There's also this misconception that everything was written in Latin, because churches use Latin and churches were the only places that taught you how to write. And the number of ways this is wrong is another class in and of itself. Like, yes, stuff was written in Latin, especially liturgical stuff. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Kings of Britain was supposedly a translation of some ancient historical work he just discovered, but is actually just making him make stuff up to fill in gaps and using actual older histories that he cherry-picked to fit his narrative. I lost my sentence again. Where was I going with that? Okay, so his History of Kings is in Latin, which, while written as a history, can easily be filed into the genre as secular lit. But there's a lot more vernacular stuff than folks think about. Beowulf, Bede, even the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is less lit and more historical chronicle, but whatever. These are in Old English. Nibelungenlied is in Middle High German. Old Norse for Heimskringla, Roland, Bodel, and a lot of the other Fabliaux were in Old French. Anglo-Norman for the Lays and Marie de France, Middle French for Le Mort d'Arthur. There's just so much out there, and with all the online resources we have these days, we're getting better and better translations of more and more works every day. So a lot of medieval lit is anonymous. There are a lot of proposed reasons for this. One is that there just aren't enough documents remaining. The guy who wrote this one poem may put his name on the original, but once it became famous, maybe subsequent copies didn't get the name, because duh, everyone knows who wrote that. I have some problems with this theory, but it's not entirely unsubstantiated. There's also a tradition of, well, this isn't my story to claim. I'm just adding bits to it because that's totally a thing we do. And, you know, that copy with the added bits is, you know, what happens to have gotten preserved. So that might be a contributing factor. Anything written by the church for the church often lacked a named author, because it was often more about the dialogue itself. But that, of course, isn't a hard and fast rule. Also, a lot of cultures were still heavily steeped in oral traditions for a chunk of the time period. So there are a lot of reasons for the lack of credited authorship. If I recall correctly, the earliest poem in English whose author is known is Cadmon's Hymn, 7th century, which is a simple hymn praising God, composed by a literate shepherd who heard it sung to him in a vision. It was then written down in Old English by some unnamed scribe in Northumbria, and then it was put into Bede's writings. It's quite pretty, and you'll still see stylistic similarities in later works, like Dream of the Rood, also from the 7th century, even Battle of Malvern from late 10th century. Beowulf falls between those two time periods and had the same cadence of the alliterative long line rhythm that resonates with audiences to this day. Sorry, I got sidetracked again. So when you're first diving into medieval lit, especially the earliest stuff we have records of, Something you'll likely notice pretty quickly is that there are a bazillion versions of everything. Not only were there different oral traditions, but different versions had entirely different story arcs. You also find a sudden burst of 6th century, 3rd century, 2nd century CE, stories where our first surviving records from 10th, 11th, 12th century. This is a combination of a burst in simply writing oral traditions down, as well as honestly not having surviving written versions that are older. The early secular stuff is also debatable on whether or not it can be even categorized as secular, because a lot of it was like Norse and Slavic mythological material, which could very easily be slotted as religious. Just because we see something as quote-unquote myth in the modern era doesn't mean folks didn't take it as seriously as some modern folks take the Bible. For the secular stuff, it ranges. The basic forms are usually broken into drama, histories, and fables. You get a lot of prose that rose out of the oral tradition. You get epic poems about adventures, tragedies, or just this really random cattle raid poem, which isn't random, I know, I'm just being snarky. But the chansons de geste also included romantic themes, but also adventures and conquests. So what was I talking about? The chansons de geste also included romantic themes, also adventures and conquests. Like, yes, there was romance, but it was more about the chivalric approach to it and its literary use as a supporting side story rather than the quote-unquote love story, if that makes sense, which is different than chivalric romance narratives, which focus on the love and courtly manners more. Honestly, if you have the chance, try to dive in on courtly love literature. It has this whole perspective that actual true love is either fleeting or unattainable, and at the end of it all, lovers either had to part way or die in some horrifically tragic way. Happily ever after doesn't exist. So there's even some claims that the weirdness that is courtly love literature was all cleverly coded to quote-unquote scripture for the Cathars. So yeah, just a fun thing to research. Just like visualizations in medieval manuscripts, it also features a lot of anthropomorphized animals as characters, usually as a part of some moral lesson or satirizing human nature or that kind of thing. I quite like it. It's another layer to why I love Disney's Robin Hood. Sorry, another tangent. Anywho, so you also see political writings. The Armis Prydain, I think is how it's pronounced, is a poem that to me reads like a movie trailer. It's the year 1000. Brythonic peoples have allied themselves with the Vikings, Irish, and Scots. Together, they drive the Anglo-Saxons from their lands forever. Like, it's definitely political commentary, but I really love it. The Galliards are also a hoot because it's a bunch of teenage and early 20 clergy who wrote satirical Latin poetry structured like actual liturgical poetry because they studied under the church, but were like, wow, y'all are super hypocritical, and I don't like the lives you lead. You, of course, have like the pilgrimage and travel literature, most famous of which is Canterbury. They talked about a lot of these magical far-off places encountered by pilgrims and traders and what have you. It's kind of like us looking at a travel magazine for a place we know we'll never be able to afford to go. Now, it's also not like authors were stuck in certain categories either. You found folks who wrote a ton of religious stuff alongside very secular stuff as well. Judah Halevi is a Jewish poet that did both and is one of the most prominent authors in medieval poetry for both secular and religious poems. You also get this straddling in line with later female authors as well. Earlier period, one of the most accepted ways for a female to be an author was in religious writing. But later on, you start to see more and more secular stuff as well. There's a great book about all that. I forget who it's by. It's Women Writers of the Middle Ages? Women Readers of the Middle Ages by G something. I'll look it up later. The religious stuff was all over the place. Hymns, missals, scholarly debate. Some of my favorite theological treatises to read are by Anselm of Canterbury, who helped the Greek bishops and pagan-born Italian bishops, sort of align those Greco-Roman pagan ideals with the church doctrines. So you get some really interesting stuff with him. I also like Thomas Aquinas, or Aquinas, it depends on who's saying it, who is a philosopher, a jurist in the scholasticism tradition, and he's both a natural reason theologian and a speculative reason theologian who embraced Aristotelian philosophies. So just super interesting perspective. A lot of folks love Abelard, and yeah, he's super smart, but I just don't enjoy reading his stuff, though your mileage may vary. Golden Legend was a hagiographic collection by Jacobus de Veragine, something like that. Hagiographic being like saintly and iconographic backstories, if you will, and it was said to be more popular than the literal Bible for a while. Rambam and Rashi are good sources for Jewish philosophers. There's a lot of religious literature out there, but it's legitimately just not what I studied, if I'm being perfectly frank. Like, I read some, but secular is more my jam. The other aspect of religious versus secular is the fact that allegory was a very, very common literary device. It was one of the primary ways to convey, in this episode, the moral we learned was, but is it religious because it uses allegory, or in spite of it? Is it secular because the surface contents are secular, or does the deeper level make it religious? So there's a lot of wiggle room in those categories, even if they seem like such black and white entities. So I think that's a bit about it for a basic crash course. Sorry for the pause in the middle and the technical difficulties earlier. If you need me to answer some questions or write down a word that I said so you can Google it or whatever, just let me know. Like Rambam is R-A-M-B-A-M, and it's the acronym for the Maimonides, or Maimonides. This is why I say Rambam. Maimonides is M-A-I-M-O-N-I-D-E-S, that sort of thing. If you need me to be like, hey, you said this word at this minute, or what was that about? So let me know. Hopefully this gives you basic footing though, and just in time because my phone is running out of memory. All right, bye folks.